Welcome back to the channel, folks. And buckle up, because what just went down in the United Kingdom is the kind of political drama you usually only see in TV shows like House of Cards. But this time, it's real, it's raw, and it's historic. A British Prime Minister, yes, the most powerful man in Britain, just got physically thrown out of Parliament on live television. Let me say that again because it doesn't even sound real. The sitting Prime Minister was escorted out of the House of Commons by security guards. Never in modern history has this happened before. This wasn't a gaffe, this wasn't a bad headline. This was a full-blown meltdown, caught on camera, witnessed by millions, and now reshaping the very foundations of British politics. Now, before we break down exactly what went wrong, let me ask you, have you ever seen a world leader lose control so completely that security had to step in? Because that's what happened, and the ripple effect is already shaking up not just Britain, but allies across Europe, America, and the Commonwealth. The day started like any other Wednesday at Westminster. Prime Minister's Questions, known as PMQs, was scheduled for noon. For those who don't know, PMQs is basically Britain's Super Bowl of political theatre. Every Wednesday, the Prime Minister stands up and faces questions, sometimes softball, but usually brutal attacks, from the opposition. It's chaotic, loud, and often nasty. But it's also tradition. The chamber was packed. Green benches filled with MPs from every party, cameras were rolling. The world was watching. No one, not one person, expected this session to become a political earthquake. At exactly 12:15 p.m, Nigel Farage, the reformist firebrand who has spent decades trying to blow up Britain's political establishment, stood up. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks. In his hands, he carried not just papers, but ammunition, leaked documents, immigration statistics, financial data, all of it carefully assembled to hit the Prime Minister where it hurts most, his record on border security and immigration. Farage started calmly. No shouting, no wild gestures. Just facts. Cold, precise, brutal facts. He said, "Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised to stop the boats. Instead, we've seen record numbers crossing the Channel. Over 45,000 illegal arrivals this year alone. Deportation flights cancelled. Hotels costing taxpayers billions. And now, as leaked documents show secret negotiations with Brussels about rejoining EU migration schemes. This isn't leadership. This is betrayal boom." That landed like a hammer. The chamber shifted. Labour MPs, usually quick to heckle, went quiet. The Prime Minister's face reddened. The weight of Farage's words cut through the usual theatre. Farage didn't stop. The British people voted for control of their borders. They voted for sovereignty. Instead, they got chaos, excuses, and cover-ups. When will this Prime Minister admit his policies have failed? It was devastating. Even some Labour loyalists looked uncomfortable. This wasn't just political sparring. It was a systematic takedown, and everyone knew it. And then, the moment. The spark that lit the fire. The Prime Minister didn't wait for recognition. He didn't even rise in the proper parliamentary way. He exploded. He jumped from his seat, pointed his finger at Farage like a man possessed, and shouted, "How dare you!" His voice cracked. His hands shook. His face was bright red. "How dare you lecture this government about compassion when all you spread is hatred and division?" The chamber went dead silent. You could feel the air being sucked out of the room. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was personal. Veteran MPs sat frozen. Conservative benches stared in shock. Even Farage looked stunned. The Prime Minister, the man trusted to lead Britain, was having a full-blown meltdown on live TV. The Speaker tried to intervene. "Order! The Prime Minister will resume his seat." But he didn't. He kept shouting, kept jabbing his finger, spit flying, his voice rising with every word. "You are a disgrace to this chamber," he bellowed. "You have no right to speak about British values when you've spent your entire career tearing this country apart." This was it. The tipping point. The most powerful man in Britain had lost it. And that's when the Speaker did something historic. Something so rare most MPs had forgotten it was even possible. He invoked Standing Order 43, a rule that gives the Speaker absolute authority to remove any member who refuses to maintain order in the chamber. And yes, that includes the Prime Minister. The Speaker's voice rang out. "I direct the Prime Minister to withdraw from this chamber immediately." Gasps echoed across the hall. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, in a moment that will be replayed for decades, security guards walked forward. Slowly, almost cautiously, they flanked the Prime Minister. At first, he resisted. He shouted, "This is outrageous! You can't be serious." But nobody came to his rescue. Not his ministers, not his MPs, not a single person. And then, in front of the cameras, in front of the nation, the Prime Minister, shoulders slumped, face pale with disbelief, was escorted out of Parliament like a disorderly guest at a bar. Ladies and gentlemen, history had been made. The cameras caught every second of it. The Prime Minister, the man who only minutes earlier was shouting, jabbing his finger, losing his grip on the chamber, now slumped and silent, being led out by 2 security guards. And in that eerie silence, Nigel Farage's voice cut through like a knife, calm, steady, almost pitying. He said, "This is what happens when politicians can't defend their failures. They lash out, they break down, but the people of Britain deserve leadership, not tantrums." The contrast could not have been sharper. One man exploding in rage, escorted out by force, the other standing firm, collected, in control of the moment. It was political theatre at its most brutal. And within minutes, not hours, not days, the political earthquake began. Social media lit up instantly. Hashtags like #PM thrown out and #Parliament meltdown trended worldwide. Clips of the Prime Minister's red-faced tirade, the Speaker invoking Standing Order 43, and security guards walking him out of the chamber racked up millions of views. TikTok stitched it into memes within seconds. Twitter was flooded with reaction videos. Instagram Reels spread the footage like wildfire. In the age of social media, perception moves faster than reality, and this was perception on steroids. By the end of the day, the clip had been seen by tens of millions around the world. But the real fallout? It came in the numbers. Snap polls taken just hours after the incident showed the Prime Minister's approval ratings plummeting, down 15 points in a single night. For a leader who was already battling low popularity, this was catastrophic. Focus groups were brutal. Words like unhinged, unstable, embarrassing came up again and again. Even among Labour's traditional base, voters who had stood by the party for decades, the mood was sour. One caller to a Manchester radio station summed it up perfectly. If he can't control himself in Parliament, how can he control the country? Meanwhile, Nigel Farage and Reform UK were riding a wave. Their website crashed under the sheer volume of new members signing up. Donations poured in at record levels. Local chapters reported lines of people waiting to join. And Farage himself? He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He played it cool. Just hours after the meltdown, he stepped outside Parliament and gave a press conference that some analysts are already calling the speech that changed British politics. What we witnessed today, Farage said, wasn't just a loss of temper. It was a loss of authority, a loss of credibility, a loss of the basic self-control required to lead a nation. Britain faces enormous challenges, from immigration to economic uncertainty to our place in the world. And what we saw from our Prime Minister was the opposite of leadership. It was devastating, calm, measured, and impossible to ignore. The clip of Farage's press statement went viral in its own right, 50 million views in 24 hours. International reaction came almost immediately. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all broke into programming to run the footage. The Washington Post headline read, "British Prime Minister ejected from Parliament in unprecedented move." The New York Times called it a constitutional crisis in the making. Across the Atlantic, US late-night shows wasted no time turning the meltdown into comedy gold. Jimmy Fallon joked, "When your boss drags you out of the office, that's bad. When the Speaker of the House drags you out of Parliament, that's historic." But it wasn't all jokes. At the White House, officials were asked if they still had confidence in the British government's stability. The response was carefully worded, diplomatic, but clearly cautious. And that hesitation said it all. Meanwhile, in Europe, the reaction was equally sharp. France and Germany expressed concerns about stability in Britain. Canada and Australia, two of Britain's closest Commonwealth partners, privately raised alarms about upcoming trade talks. Britain's international reputation as a stable democracy, a model of parliamentary order, had taken a massive hit. Back home, Labour was in full-blown panic. Emergency meetings were called. WhatsApp groups among MPs lit up with anger and disbelief. Senior figures who had spent months defending the Prime Minister were now whispering behind closed doors about his fitness for office. Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner was reportedly furious, telling allies that the Prime Minister had embarrassed not just the Labour Party, but Britain itself. Other big names, Yvette Cooper, Wes Streeting, David Lammy, suddenly found their names being floated as potential successors. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party pounced like sharks, smelling blood in the water. Rishi Sunak, standing at a press conference, didn't mince words. A Prime Minister who cannot control himself cannot control the country. This government has lost all authority and must go. And here's where things got even more dangerous. Constitutional experts started weighing in, and their warnings were chilling. Professor Vernon Bogdanor, one of Britain's top constitutional scholars, went on BBC that night and said flatly, "We have entered uncharted territory. Never before has a Prime Minister been ejected under Standing Order 43. The question now is, can he even continue in office after such a humiliation?" In other words, Britain might not just be facing a political scandal, it could be staring down a full-blown constitutional crisis. And through it all, silence. Total silence from number 10 Downing Street. For 48 hours after the meltdown, the Prime Minister vanished. No statement, no press conference, no apology, no explanation. The most powerful man in Britain went dark at the very moment when leadership was most needed. That silence was deadly. Because in politics, if you don't tell your story, somebody else will tell it for you. And in this case, it was Nigel Farage and an army of social media users writing the script. The Prime Minister's downfall was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. By the time the Prime Minister finally broke his silence, more than 2 full days after his ejection, the damage was already done. Britain had moved on, the story had hardened, and the verdict was brutal. When he did speak, his words fell flat. A hastily arranged press conference at number 10 was meant to calm the storm. Instead, it poured gasoline on the fire. He insisted his outburst was nothing more than passionate defence of his government's policies. He claimed his emotions showed how deeply he cared about the country, but for voters watching at home, it looked less like passion and more like damage control. Focus groups slammed it. He looked weak. He looked desperate. He looked like a man clinging to power. Those were the exact words pollsters kept hearing. Inside the Labour Party, panic had morphed into open rebellion. Senior MPs who once stood shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister were now publicly hedging their bets. Cabinet ministers sent to defend him. On television, squirmed under tough questions. Even long-time Labour loyalists admitted privately the meltdown might have doomed them. And then came the polling numbers that no party leader wants to see. Labour's numbers crashed to 28%, their lowest since the disastrous 2019 election defeat. Reform UK surged to 23%, leapfrogging into contention as a serious national force. The Conservatives ticked upward to 31%. But the most shocking figure, in leadership polling, when voters were asked who they thought would make the best Prime Minister, Nigel Farage had rocketed into second place. Behind Rishi Sunak, yes, but ahead of the sitting Prime Minister. Think about that. A man who has never held government office was suddenly seen as more capable of leading Britain than the current occupant of number 10. It wasn't just numbers, it was geography. Regional polling showed Reform UK making unprecedented inroads into Labour's heartlands in the North and Midlands. In some constituencies, Reform wasn't just competitive, they were leading. That sound you hear? That's the crumbling of the political map that has defined Britain for decades. The media piled on. The Guardian called it a moment of madness that could destroy Labour's future. The Daily Mail splashed with the headline, "PM loses it." Even the Mirror, traditionally loyal to Labour, couldn't defend him. Their front page simply read, "What have you done?" On TV, the footage was dissected like a crime scene. Body language experts analysed every twitch, every finger point, every drop of sweat. Voice coaches studied his cracking tone. Psychologists speculated about stress, burnout, and whether the job had finally broken him. And in the culture at large, the meltdown took on a life of its own. Comedians turned it into late-night fodder. TikTok creators remixed the footage into music videos. Memes flooded Instagram and Twitter. The phrase, "thrown out of Parliament," became shorthand for losing control. But beneath the jokes, something darker was happening. Public trust in Britain's political system, already battered by years of Brexit chaos and revolving door prime ministers, sank to record lows. Polls showed that only 23% of Britons now had confidence in their government. That's the lowest number since records began. Nigel Farage knew exactly how to exploit that moment. Reform UK rolled out a nationwide tour of town halls and rallies. In packed community centres, Farage would show clips of the meltdown on giant screens. He'd stand at the podium, arms folded, let the footage play, and then ask the crowd, "Is this leadership? Is this what you voted for?" The answer, shouted back by hundreds of angry voices, was always the same: no. His message was simple: the establishment has failed. The system is broken, and only reform offers the steady, clear-headed leadership Britain desperately needs. Meanwhile, Labour's attempts at spin crashed and burned. Party strategists tried to frame the meltdown as a moment of humanity. They pushed the narrative that their leader was a man so passionate about Britain's future that he couldn't contain his emotions. But focus groups rejected it outright. Voters didn't see humanity. They saw instability. They saw weakness. They saw a man cracking under pressure. The panic inside Labour reached fever pitch. Backbench MPs started openly questioning whether the Prime Minister could survive. Whispers of a leadership challenge grew louder, and then the rebellion began. Within 3 weeks of the meltdown, a group of Labour MPs formally submitted a letter of no confidence in his leadership. The charge was devastating, that he had brought disgrace to the party and undermined public faith in Parliament. The knives were out, and this wasn't coming from political enemies across the aisle, it was coming from his own side. As the storm raged, constitutional experts returned to the same chilling question. Can a Prime Minister who has been physically removed from Parliament still govern? The answer wasn't clear, but the doubt itself was enough to plunge Britain deeper into crisis. Internationally, the meltdown was still reverberating. Commonwealth leaders, from Canada to Australia, privately admitted concerns about Britain's reliability. European leaders worried about negotiating with a government in chaos. American officials hinted, quietly but firmly, that trust in the UK's stability had been shaken. Think about that. Britain, once the poster child for political stability, was now being talked about in the same breath as countries with shaky democracies. That's how deep this wound cut. And through it all, Reform UK kept growing. Their rallies looked more like rock concerts than political events. Their donation totals shattered records. And their leader, Nigel Farage, was suddenly being talked about as not just a protest figure, but a legitimate contender for number 10. In just weeks, one meltdown had redrawn the entire map of British politics. But as shocking as that was, the real question was still ahead. Could the Prime Minister survive the rebellion inside his own party? Or was this the beginning of the end? 3 weeks after the meltdown, the walls of number 10 were closing in. The whispers had become open rebellion. The Labour Party, once united in its mission to reclaim Britain after years of Conservative rule, was now eating itself alive. It started with a letter, a carefully worded, devastating letter of no confidence, signed by a growing bloc of Labour MPs. Their accusation, that the Prime Minister had brought shame on Parliament, discredited the Labour movement, and jeopardised Britain's standing in the world. In short, he had to go. Behind closed doors, senior Labour figures were furious. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, was reportedly livid, telling allies that the meltdown had humiliated Britain on the global stage. Other big names, Yvette Cooper, David Lammy, Wes Streeting, were suddenly being whispered about as potential successors. Leadership speculation was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. The Prime Minister's defenders tried to hold the line. They insisted it was a one-off moment of passion. They begged colleagues not to tear the party apart just months before crucial elections. But the truth was undeniable, the damage was done. Meanwhile, the Conservatives smelled blood. Rishi Sunak and his allies pushed for an immediate vote of no confidence in Parliament. His argument was simple. If the Prime Minister can't control himself in the chamber, how can he control the country? That soundbite was repeated across TV, newspapers and social media until it became unavoidable. And it wasn't just the opposition. Constitutional scholars were openly questioning whether a Prime Minister forcibly removed under Standing Order 43 could even remain in office. Some warned that his authority had been fatally compromised. Others argued that his behaviour constituted a breach of the ministerial code, grounds for resignation or removal. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was even harsher. Labour's poll numbers had cratered. Reform UK, riding Farage's surge, was now within striking distance of overtaking them in key regions. For the first time in modern history, a fringe insurgent movement was threatening to rewrite the political order. And Farage? He played the moment like a master strategist. At rallies across the country, he replayed the footage of the meltdown on giant screens. He'd pause, let the image of the Prime Minister being escorted out sink in, and then deliver the same question. Is this leadership? Is this what Britain deserves? Crowds roared back with a thunderous no. The reform surge became unstoppable. Donations flooded in, membership soared. The energy on the ground dwarfed anything Labour could muster. For millions of disillusioned Britons, the meltdown was more than just a bad day in Parliament. It was proof that the establishment was broken beyond repair. Meanwhile, inside number 10, the Prime Minister's team was scrambling. Some pushed for a tearful public apology. Others urged him to double down and portray himself as a victim of unfair treatment. But every move backfired. When he finally did appear on television again, sitting stiffly in an interview chair, he looked tired, beaten, almost broken. His words rang hollow. "I care deeply about this country, and yes, sometimes my passion shows. But I will not apologise for fighting for Britain's future." The reaction was devastating. On social media, voters mocked him. On talk radio, callers ripped him apart. On late-night TV, comedians reenacted the meltdown for laughs. The idea that he was fighting for Britain was drowned out by memes showing him being dragged out of Parliament. The image had stuck, and in politics, images are everything. The turning point came when senior Labour MPs began publicly distancing themselves. Some stopped using his name in interviews. Others quietly signalled they'd back a new leader if one emerged. By the end of the month, the rebellion was no longer simmering, it was boiling over. And so, Britain found itself on the edge of yet another political cliff. The Prime Minister clung to power, but his authority was shattered. Labour's credibility was in tatters. Reform UK was rewriting the political script. And the world was watching in disbelief. Think about that. Britain, once the poster child of stable democracy, was now the site of late-night comedy jokes, international headlines about instability, and serious whispers in foreign capitals about whether the UK could still be trusted as a partner. The question now wasn't just about one man's meltdown, it was about the future of British democracy itself. Could the Labour Party survive with a leader so badly damaged? Could Britain restore its reputation on the world stage? Or were we witnessing the birth of a new political era? One where Nigel Farage, the ultimate outsider, was suddenly a contender for number 10. And that, my friends, is where we are. An unprecedented moment, a nation in shock, a political system at breaking point. Because here's the truth. One outburst, one meltdown, one historic moment in Parliament didn't just change the career of a Prime Minister. It may have changed Britain forever. So what happens next? Does Labour knife their leader and gamble on fresh blood? Does Reform UK complete its meteoric rise and crash the gates of Westminster? Or does Britain, once again, stumble into another round of political chaos that leaves its people disillusioned and furious? One thing is certain, history has already been written. The day a British Prime Minister was thrown out of Parliament will never be forgotten, and its consequences are only just beginning.